Orders and the ability of people to follow them is what distinguishes professional militaries from the rabble of an armed mob. Disobeying orders cuts at the very foundation of military discipline and can have disastrous consequences beyond just the damage caused by an individual person. But what happens when a soldier disobeys an order? Some examples of insubordination worked out, such as when Admiral Nelson disobeyed orders of naval doctrine to win the decisive Battle of Trafalgar. However, disobeying orders by individuals can also turn out very badly, such as when several Marines in Afghanistan desecrated the corpses of dead Taliban fighters and severely damaged the U.S. image in the region. Disobeying an order can take a wide form of acts, but can be broadly interpreted as breaking some sort of military law or regulation or failing to carry out an action. Some common examples of disobeying orders could be as trivial as failing to have proper uniform or being late to an appointed place of duty. Disobedience can then go to serve as breaking lawful orders to not disturb civilian property, to cowardice before the enemy, and desertion. All of the rules and regulations that troops must follow are usually codified in law, such as the United States under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Punishments today for failure to obey orders pale in comparison to what was handed down in the past, depending on the country, era, and conflict. While in the U.S. military today, troops might face worst-case scenario fines, some jail time, and a less than honorable discharge, that was not always the case. Rather, military justice in the past, even in the U.S. military, was largely focused on both corporeal and collective punishment to mete out those who disobeyed orders and discourage others from doing the same. To get an idea of where military justice comes from, one must look back into ancient times, at one of the most successful and well-documented militaries, the Roman military. The Roman military fought and won battles across 3 continents and against dozens of enemies, often to their numerical disadvantage. To maintain order and discipline, the Roman army, both during the Republic and Empire, would often issue death sentences for those who disobeyed orders. Though not the most common sentence, the most well-documented punishment for disobeying orders for entire units, usually in battle, was the decimation. Coming from the Latin word to remove a tenth, this was the ultimate punishment to render units who failed to perform satisfactorily to a commander's orders. Though carried out sparingly through the 800 years of Roman history, the impact was well noted. If a unit was selected for decimation, the entire unit would be separated into 10-man groups, and each man would draw lots. Then, one unlucky enough to be chosen would be beaten to death by the other 9 men in his group, and the rest would be forced to live outside the protection of the camp for an undetermined amount of time until the commander decided that they could rejoin the rest of the army. Probably the most well-known, though hotly debated and probably fictional story of decimation was that of the Theban Legion in 265 AD. The Theban Legion was commanded by a man named Mauritius and was recruited primarily from amongst the Coptic Christians in Egypt. It was during this time that the Roman authorities were really trying to crack down on Christians in the empire, and the idea of having Christians in the ranks displeased the emperor. Despite their doubts of the loyalty of the legion, the Romans sent them to Gaul to quell an uprising. After a successful campaign, the men were ordered to take part in a ritual to the Roman emperor Maximilian, honoring him as a god. The Christian men refused to do so and were then ordered to be decimated. After the first decimation, the men were resolute in their belief not to partake and were decimated again and again until the entire unit had killed itself. Then, those not present at the battle who had been guarding the other posts along the way were summarily executed by the Romans. Though this is the most fantastical story of decimation, there were multiple verified occurrences of the practice, such as during the war on Spartacus, the infamous slave rebellion the TV show was based on, where several hundred men were killed. There were also several occurrences in the late Roman Republic, but the practice seemed to have died off by the time the Roman Empire came around, which casts even more doubt on the story of the Theban Legion. From the fall of the Roman Empire until the mid-1800s, the majority of the world's militaries would rely on corporeal punishment for soldiers and sailors to keep them in line. One of the best examples of pre-modern militaries was that of the Russian army. After the ascension of Peter the Great to power, he wanted to transform the Russian military into a respectable and feared force on par with any from Western Europe. To do so, he would implement traditions that would become the backbone of the Russian military discipline for years to come. For offenses as minor as losing one's flint for a musket, beatings and whippings were authorized. It was also up to the most senior officers closest to the soldier to order the punishment, so there would be a wide variety in punishments and there was no uniformity. As a last resort, Russian officers could even condemn a man to exile in Siberia, being forced out of the army with only the clothes on his back. This kind of crude treatment was also seen in both the British and later American militaries of the time. Starting in the British Army and then being used by colonial troops in America, a common method of military punishment was called riding the mule. The mule in this case was not your favorite farm animal, but rather a wooden device shaped to look like a mule that a man was forced to sit on. Upon the conclusion of a court-martial, a man would be forced to sit on the mule for hours or even days at a time. To make the suffering worse, weights or sometimes muskets were tied to the feet of the prisoner to keep him squarely on the mule. Though the tip was usually rounded or blunted off, the prisoner would still face a considerable amount of pain. Another common method in the British and American military militaries to punish those who disobeyed orders was to have their wrists tied to a high pole and then be allowed to support themselves with just one foot on a sharpened stake. What makes this punishment so brutal was the fact that in order to prevent the spike from cutting into their foot, the condemned would have to support all their weight on their wrist, which would then cause immense pain. Because of the great amount of pain this would cause and the potential for permanent bodily injury, this punishment, unlike riding the mule, would only be carried out in 15-minute increments. Despite these two methods being primarily army methods of punishment, that does not mean the British and American navies did not have their own means of punishing those who disobeyed orders. From the beginning of the Continental Navy until the mid-1850s, flogging was the most common way soldiers were disciplined when underway. Once the accused was whipped, he would be then sent back to work with no period of confinement. Navy commanders did not like the idea of confinement underway since it would only make the workload on those who followed the rules greater, and corporeal punishment was seen as a way to hold people accountable without making those who followed the rules suffer. It was during that time that the Navy decided to use a more progressive form of punishments for sailors by incorporating fines, confinement, reduction in rank, and dishonorable discharges as a way to retain only professional sailors. Though the days of corporeal punishment are long over, some holdouts from this period continued in the U.S. Navy tradition until as recently as 2018, such as the punishment of only eating bread and water for minor offenses for 3 days at a time. Additionally, in the Navy going to non-judicial punishment, it's still called captain's mast in reference to the days of sail, where sailors were tied to a mast and whipped. The legacy of more progressive punishments beyond corporeal punishment and execution continued into the American Civil War. Especially during the early months of the war, desertion was common and practically unpunished. It was not until August of 1862 that the first deserters would be executed, but this punishment would only be carried out sparingly by both sides throughout the war, with death sentences usually only carried out against serial offenders. Rather, both North and South adopted alternative punishments to death sentences, especially as the war dragged on and they needed all the manpower they could get. For disobeying orders, soldiers could have brands put on their bodies like D for deserter, be forced to sit on the mule, be confined to prison, forfeit their pay, and lose leave. Though losing leave might not seem like a big deal, to someone who's been through countless battles and possibly been away from home for years, not having time to spend with loved ones would have been quite the blow. After the Civil War, Western militaries kept death sentences on the books for crimes like treason, cowardice, and desertion, but these were rarely, if ever, carried out. Rather, the British military created a new codified military justice regulation manual in the 1880s that gave legal definitions of military crimes and the recommended punishments for commanders to follow. Among the most famous of these was Field Punishment Number 1, and it would be carried out over 60,000 times during the First World War. Field Punishment Number 1 was seen as the worst punishment a man could get besides being executed, meted out for a variety of infractions like refusing to advance, unauthorized retreating, and cowardice before the enemy. It was a frightening experience. Depending on the circumstances of the case, the man could be strapped to a pole in the open for days, weeks, or even months, as in the case of some conscientious objectors who refused to fight. During this time, the men would be exposed to enemy fire and the elements, all while in a stressed position that would not allow them to rest comfortably while on the pole. The punishment would usually be carried out only for a certain number of hours each day, so as to allow the men time to eat, rest, use the bathroom, and then go at it again the next day. Though this was incredibly cruel, it paled in comparison to the most extreme punishments given by some of the other warring nations. Italy and Austro-Hungary were two of the major powers in the First World War, though they get little mention in Western history. That might be for good reason, since there are some facts that the leadership of those countries might want to forget. Harkening back to the days of Imperial Rome, Supreme Italian Commander Luigi Cardona brought back the Roman use of decimation, starting in 1916. During his many fruitless assaults on the Isonzo front, troop morale was low due to high casualties and nothing to show for it. One unit of the Italian army, the 141st Catanzaro Infantry Brigade, refused to participate anymore in the senseless slaughter and had to be forced at gunpoint to go to the front. Cardona was so infuriated at the incident that he ordered the decimation of most of the guilty company, and 10 more were selected at random and shot. Though Italy was not the only country to carry out a decimation, since France did so in 1914 of a company that had retreated in battle. It was the most notable due to the fact that Cardona wanted this to be a mainstream policy, since he viewed the average Italian soldier as just a brute that could only be dealt with by force. Austro-Hungary was also a very guilty party for carrying out death sentences. Though outranked by Italy, Britain, and France as far as number of death sentences issued, Austro-Hungary executed 98% of those condemned. This appalling figure is in spite of the countless extrajudicial executions for offenses like cowardice that occurred in the field without official records. Despite the horrors of World War I, some militaries would continue and even expand punishments for those who could not follow orders, with the new Red Army being the most notable example. Though the committee that formed after the February 1917 revolution outlawed the flogging of troops, as was common during the war, in the ensuing Civil War and years after, the Red Army adopted even more draconian tactics. Harkening back to the days of the Tsars, generals and admirals in the Soviet military relied upon a secret police force to infiltrate the ranks and report any behavior not conforming to military discipline or communist ideals. Those unlucky enough to be reported by the police would often be interrogated under torture to admit their crimes. These coerced confessions could then be used against them to send them to labor camps in Siberia if they were lucky, or to their deaths if not. These punishments were routinely carried out throughout the Russian Civil War and reached a crescendo during the Great Purges of the 1930s. Once World War II started, only those troops serving the Soviet Union and Germany faced the most severe punishments for disobeying orders. Both countries had what were called penal battalions. These were organizations of men who had either been convicted for any number of crimes in military court, or who might have been civilian prisoners. Either way, both sides used these units as a deterrent against disorder in the ranks, since they were often given the most dangerous and least survivable missions. Even if one was lucky enough to survive the hell that was the Eastern Front, if you were a Russian soldier, that did not mean you were out of the woods yet. Issued in the summer of 1942, Stalin's famous General Order No. 227 became a show of just how desperate the situation had become. The order created blocking detachments of troops that were ordered to shoot down all those withdrawing without orders. It also made surrendering to the enemy a crime, and for many Soviet prisoners of war, their liberation from the hands of the Germans were not joyous. Because this order made it a crime to surrender to the Germans, hundreds of thousands of ex-Soviet POWs found themselves transferred from a concentration camp to a gulag after being liberated for their betraying their motherland. From Roman times throughout the end of the Second World War, professional military sought a variety of cruel and inhumane means of disciplining those who cannot conform. From corporeal punishment through the liberal use of the death penalty, the punishments for disobedience in the military varied wildly depending on the country and the conflict. Despite this wide disparity in punishments, the one commonality is that at least today those in professional militaries across the world who are accused of crimes against the military rules and regulations are afforded due process of law and appropriate punishments. Though units will never be decimated anymore, militaries do desire to hold people who disobey accountable to avoid having to resort to the methods of the past. Those who show a track record of rule breaking are simply kicked out.